You know that feeling when you're sitting alone on Christmas Eve, staring at a frozen dinner you just pulled out of the microwave, and you can hear your neighbors laughing through the walls? That was me. 28 years old, successful marketing consultant, living in a decent apartment in downtown Seattle, and spending the holidays completely alone while my entire family gathered at my sister's house in Portland. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I guess you could say I've always been the odd one out in my family. My older sister Jennifer had the picture-perfect life, married to her high school sweetheart Michael, 3 beautiful kids, a house with a white picket fence, the whole package. My younger brother Daniel was the golden child, the athlete who got a full scholarship to USC and now works as a physical therapist. And then there was me, the workaholic, the one who chose career over family dinners, the one who missed birthdays because of client meetings, the one who always had an excuse. It wasn't that I didn't love my family. I did. I loved them so much it hurt sometimes. But somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that success meant sacrifice. That if I wanted to make it in the competitive world of marketing, I had to give everything to my career. Every holiday, every family gathering, every Sunday dinner became another opportunity I passed up because I had a presentation to prepare or a campaign to launch. The breaking point came last Thanksgiving. I'd promised my mom, Catherine, that I would definitely be there. She'd called me 3 times to confirm, and each time I'd said the same thing. Jennifer was hosting, and Mom had made it clear how important it was that we all be together. My dad, Robert, had been having some health issues, nothing too serious, but enough to make everyone a little more aware of time passing. But then my biggest client, a tech startup called Vision Tech, scheduled an emergency meeting for the day before Thanksgiving. They were about to close a major funding round and needed the marketing strategy finalized. I told myself it would just be a few hours. I'd drive down to Portland right after. Except the meeting ran long, then there were revisions, then more revisions, and by the time I looked at the clock, it was 9 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. I called Jennifer to apologize. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the disappointment in her voice before she even said hello. Jennifer said she'd saved me a plate. That Mom had kept checking her phone all day, thinking maybe I'd sent a message she'd missed. That Dad had asked about me 3 times during dinner. That the kids had made me place cards and everything. I felt terrible, but I also felt defensive. I tried to explain about the client, about how important this account was for my career. Jennifer just sighed and said we'd talk later. Then she hung up. I told myself she'd understand eventually, that they all would. Success required sacrifice, right? The weeks after Thanksgiving were weird. Mom stopped calling as much. When she did call, the conversations were shorter, more formal. Dad would get on the phone and ask how I was doing, but there was something different in his tone, like he was being careful with me. Jennifer barely texted anymore, and when she did, it was just logistics, nothing personal. Daniel tried to stay neutral, but even he seemed distant. Christmas was coming up fast, and I knew I had to make a decision. Vision Tech was launching their product in January, which meant December was crunch time. My calendar was packed with meetings, reviews, strategy sessions. But I also knew that if I missed another holiday, something fundamental might break in my relationship with my family. I wrestled with it for days. I'd open my laptop to block out time for the drive to Portland, then I'd see all the red urgent flags on my tasks and close it again. I'd pick up my phone to call Mom and tell her I was definitely coming. Then I'd get another email from my client and put the phone down. Finally, a week before Christmas, I made the call. I dialed Jennifer's number, my heart pounding. She answered, and I could hear my niece Lily singing in the background. Jennifer said hey, and I asked if it was okay if I skipped Christmas this year. That things were just really intense at work, that I'd make it up to everyone in January. There was a long silence. Then Jennifer said that was fine. Her voice was flat, neutral. No anger, no disappointment, just acceptance. Somehow that was worse than if she'd yelled at me. She said she'd let everyone know, that they understood. Then she said she had to go help with dinner and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling this weird mix of relief and emptiness. Relief because I wouldn't have to juggle everything. Emptiness because I'd just chosen work over my family for the second major holiday in a row. I told myself it was the right decision, that one more year wouldn't matter, that I'd have plenty of Christmases with my family in the future. The days leading up to Christmas were a blur of work. I threw myself into the Vision Tech campaign, staying at the office until midnight most nights. My apartment became just a place to sleep and shower. I barely noticed when my neighbors started putting up decorations, when Christmas music started playing in every store, when the city transformed into a winter wonderland. On Christmas Eve, my office finally closed at 3 p.m. My boss, Patricia, had insisted everyone go home early. She'd looked at me with concern and said I should take some time for myself, that the work would still be there after the holidays. I'd nodded and smiled, but as soon as she left, I'd open my laptop to keep working. Around 6 p.m., my phone rang. It was Mom. My heart leaped, thinking maybe they wanted me to come after all. Maybe it wasn't too late to drive down. Catherine's voice was warm but tired when she said hello. She asked how I was doing, if I was taking care of myself. I said I was fine. Great, actually. Just busy with work. She said they all wished I could be there, that the house didn't feel right without me. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my voice steady. I told her I wished I could be there too, that next year would be different. There was another pause, and then she said she loved me, that no matter what, I was always her daughter and she loved me. I said I loved her too, and then we said goodbye. I sat in my dark office for a long time after that call. The building was empty, silent except for the hum of the heating system. Outside, snow was starting to fall, the kind of perfect, movie-like snow that makes everything look magical. I watched it through the window and felt absolutely nothing. Eventually, I packed up my stuff and headed home. The streets were quiet. Most people already settled in with their families. I passed a few restaurants that were still open, their windows glowing warm and inviting. But I didn't feel like being around people. I just wanted to get home, maybe have a drink, and go to bed so this day would be over. My apartment felt especially empty when I walked in. I'd never bothered to decorate, so there was no tree, no lights, no stockings. Just my minimalist furniture and my work setup. I changed into sweats, poured myself a glass of wine, and stood in my kitchen trying to figure out what to eat. That's when I noticed my neighbor's Christmas dinner through the shared wall. I could hear laughter, music, the sounds of a family enjoying the holiday together, kids running around, adults telling stories. The whole warm, chaotic, beautiful mess of family. And there I was, alone in my apartment, about to microwave a frozen meal. I pulled out a sad-looking lasagna from the freezer and put it in the microwave. While it heated up, I scrolled through social media, which was a mistake. My feed was full of family photos. Jennifer had posted pictures of their Christmas Eve dinner. There was Mom, looking beautiful in a red sweater. Dad, smiling but looking a little thinner than I remembered. Daniel and his girlfriend Emma, laughing at something. Jennifer's kids, adorable in their matching pajamas. And there, on the table, was an empty chair. My chair. Jennifer had captioned the photo with something simple. Christmas Eve, 2024. Grateful for family. But I noticed what she didn't say. She didn't mention me. She didn't say anything about wishing I was there. It was like I'd been edited out of the family narrative. The microwave beeped, pulling me out of my spiral. I grabbed the steaming tray, burned my fingers a little, and carried it to my small dining table. I sat down in front of my laptop, thinking I'd eat while catching up on work emails. But when I opened my inbox, I just stared at the screen without seeing anything. I took a bite of the lasagna. It was hot and tasted like cardboard. I took another bite anyway. This was my choice, right? This was what I wanted. Success, independence, career advancement. This was the price, and I was paying it willingly. Except sitting there, alone in my apartment on Christmas Eve, eating freezer-burn lasagna while my family celebrated without me, I suddenly wasn't sure if any of it was worth it. The raises, the big clients, the corner office I was working toward, none of it seemed to matter as much as being in that photo with my family, being in that empty chair. I kept scrolling through social media, torturing myself with images of what I was missing. My college roommate posted pictures of her family gathered around a piano, singing carols. My coworker from my first job shared a video of her kids opening their Christmas Eve pajamas. Even people I barely knew seemed to be surrounded by love and laughter and connection. And here I was, the successful one, the one with the impressive job title and the growing bank account, completely alone. I thought about the years leading up to this moment, the slow, gradual drift away from my family. It hadn't happened all at once. It was a series of small choices, each one seeming reasonable in the moment. Missing Jennifer's baby shower because I had a client presentation. Skipping Dad's birthday dinner because I was traveling for work. Leaving Mom's holiday party early because I needed to finish a proposal. Each time, I'd promised myself I'd make it up to them. Each time, I'd convinced myself that this sacrifice was temporary, that once I reached the next level in my career, I'd have more time. But the next level never brought more time. It just brought more responsibility, more pressure, more reasons to say no to family gatherings. And somewhere along the way, my family stopped expecting me to show up. They stopped saving me seats at the table. They stopped calling to ask if I was coming. They'd adapted to my absence, and that hurt more than anything. I remembered last Christmas, when I had actually made it to Portland. I'd arrived late on Christmas Eve, stayed for Christmas Day lunch, and then left immediately after dinner to drive back to Seattle. I told myself I was being efficient, maximizing my time. But looking back now, I could see how it must have felt to my family. Like I couldn't wait to leave. Like being with them was just another item to check off my to-do list. Jennifer had walked me to my car that night, helping me carry the gifts she'd given me. She'd hugged me goodbye, and I remembered feeling her hesitate before letting go. She'd said she wished I could stay longer, that the kids barely got to see me, that Mom had been so excited I was coming. I'd made some excuse about work, about deadlines, about responsibilities. Jennifer had just nodded and stepped back, her face carefully neutral. That was the last time I'd seen any of them in person. Almost a full year ago. A year of phone calls that got shorter and less frequent. A year of text messages that went from chatty to purely functional. A year of my family learning to have holidays and celebrations without me. And now here I was, having made the final choice to skip Christmas entirely, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd broken something irreparable. I pushed the lasagna away, suddenly not hungry at all. I finished my wine and poured another glass. Then another. I wasn't drunk, just numb enough that the loneliness didn't hurt quite as much. I thought about calling someone, a friend maybe, but most of my friends were with their own families. And the truth was, I'd let a lot of friendships slide over the past few years. Another casualty of my single-minded focus on work. Around 9 p.m., I was halfway through a bottle of wine and watching a mindless Christmas movie on Netflix when there was a knock at my door. I froze. Who would be at my door on Christmas Eve? My first thought was that it was my neighbor, maybe coming to complain about noise, though I'd been completely quiet. I got up, padding to the door in my socks, and looked through the peephole. My heart stopped. Standing in the hallway, wearing his old brown jacket and holding a small suitcase, was my grandfather. Grandpa William, my dad's father, who I hadn't seen in almost a year. The last I'd heard, he was living in a retirement community in Phoenix. I yanked the door open. William stood there, smiling that gentle smile of his white hair a bit messy from travel. He looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, but his blue eyes were as sharp as ever. I said, "Grandpa," and he said, "Hello, Rebecca." We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. Then, without thinking, I threw my arms around him. He hugged me back, and I realized I was crying. Not big dramatic sobs, just tears running down my face. He patted my back gently and said it was okay, that he was here now. I pulled back, wiping my eyes, suddenly aware of how I must look. Messy hair, old sweats, obviously having been drinking alone. I asked what he was doing here. William picked up his suitcase and asked if he could come in. I stepped aside quickly, embarrassed I hadn't invited him in immediately. He walked into my apartment, looking around with interest. He set his suitcase by the door and took off his jacket. Then he turned to me and said he'd come to have Christmas dinner with me. I stared at him. I told him I didn't have anything, that I'd already eaten, that I wasn't even celebrating Christmas. William walked over to my dining table and looked at the half-eaten frozen lasagna. He picked up the container, examined it, and made a face. He said this wasn't dinner. This was sadness in a plastic tray. Despite everything, I laughed. He always had a way of cutting through the nonsense with simple truth. I asked him again what he was really doing here, how he even knew I was alone. William sat down in my armchair, settling in like he planned to stay a while. He said he'd called my parents' house earlier, intending to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. He'd talked to Dad, and during the conversation, Robert had mentioned I wasn't coming, that I was in Seattle working. William said he'd heard something in my dad's voice, a sadness that went beyond simple disappointment. So after he hung up, he'd called me, but I hadn't answered. He'd called again an hour later. Still no answer. He'd left messages, but I hadn't called back. So he'd made a decision. He'd packed a bag, called a car to the airport, and bought a ticket to Seattle. I was stunned. I told him he shouldn't have done that he didn't need to fly all the way here just because I was spending Christmas alone, that I was fine. William looked at me with those knowing eyes and said he'd raised 3 kids and had 6 grandchildren. He knew what fine looked like, and this wasn't it. I felt my defenses crumbling. I said I'd made my choice, that I'd chosen work, that I didn't deserve anyone's pity or concern. William shook his head. He said choosing work didn't mean choosing loneliness, that success and family weren't mutually exclusive, that I'd somehow convinced myself they were, and that was the real problem. I sat down on my couch, suddenly exhausted. I asked why he cared so much, why he'd go to all this trouble for me. William smiled sadly. He said because he'd made the same mistake I was making, that when my grandmother was alive, he'd worked constantly. He'd been a civil engineer, and his projects had taken him all over the country. He'd missed birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. He'd told himself he was doing it for his family, providing for them, making a better life. Then Grandma Helen had gotten sick. Cancer, aggressive and fast. And suddenly all those missed moments, all those times he'd chosen work over being present, they all came crashing down on him. She'd died 10 years ago, and William said not a day went by that he didn't regret the time he'd wasted. Time he could never get back. He said he saw me making the same mistakes, and he couldn't just sit in Phoenix and watch it happen. So here he was, and he was hungry, and my apartment was depressing, and we were going to do something about both of those things. I asked what he meant. William stood up with surprising energy for a man in his 70s. He said we were going to make a proper Christmas Eve dinner, right here, right now. I told him I didn't have any food, that my refrigerator was basically empty except for some wilted salad and questionable takeout containers. William said then we'd go shopping. I pointed out that it was Christmas Eve, that everything was probably closed. He pulled out his phone and started searching. After a few minutes, he announced there was a 24-hour grocery store about 15 minutes away. He said we were going. I started to protest, but he gave me a look. The same look he'd given me when I was 10 and didn't want to apologize to my sister for breaking her toy. The look that said this wasn't a negotiation. I changed out of my sweats into jeans and a sweater. William put his jacket back on. We headed out into the snowy Seattle night, and I found myself feeling something I hadn't felt in months. A tiny spark of something that might have been hope. The grocery store was mostly empty, just a few other last-minute shoppers and some tired-looking staff members wearing Santa hats. Christmas music played over the speakers, but it didn't feel oppressive like it had in other stores. Here, with Grandpa pushing the cart and humming along to the music, it felt almost magical. William took charge of the shopping. He said we were making his famous Christmas Eve pasta. It was a recipe Grandma Helen had brought from her Italian family, and he'd learned to make it after she died. A way of keeping her memory alive. He gathered ingredients with confidence, commenting on the quality of the tomatoes, the freshness of the basil, the right type of pasta to use. I followed him through the aisles, and something strange started happening. People kept smiling at us. A woman with her teenage daughter wished us Merry Christmas. An elderly man in a veteran's cap nodded approvingly at our cart. The cashier, a young guy named Marcus who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, brightened when William joked with him about working on Christmas Eve. William told Marcus that his dedication was admirable, that someone's Christmas dinner was possible because Marcus was willing to be here. Marcus had shrugged, but I could see him stand a little taller. William had that effect on people. He saw them, really saw them, and made them feel valued. As we loaded the groceries onto the conveyor belt, William picked up a small poinsettia plant near the register. He added it to our purchases without comment. When I asked what it was for, he said every home needed something beautiful at Christmas. Even mine. Especially mine. It hit me that I'd forgotten how to just be present with people. How to exist in the moment without thinking about what I needed to do next, which client I needed to call, which deadline was looming. Here, in this fluorescent-lit grocery store at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, with my grandfather carefully selecting a bottle of wine, I felt more grounded than I had in months. We loaded our bags into my car and drove back to my apartment. The snow was falling heavier now, and the city looked like something out of a snow globe. William talked about Phoenix, about the retirement community where he lived. He said it was nice enough, but he missed the seasons, missed the feeling of real winter, missed his family, even though he understood everyone had their own lives. He told me about his weekly routine. Monday was water aerobics. Tuesday was poker night. Wednesday was the book club he'd joined, though he admitted he rarely finished the books. Thursday was movie night in the community center. Friday through Sunday were his own time, which he usually spent reading, working in the small garden plot he maintained, or video chatting with family members who made time for him. He said the retirement community was full of people like him. People who'd worked their whole lives, raised their families, and now found themselves with all the time in the world but nobody to spend it with. Their kids were busy. Their grandkids were growing up fast. Everyone had their own lives. He understood that. He really did. But understanding didn't make the loneliness easier. He said that's why he'd come to Seattle. Because he recognized the signs in me, the isolation disguised as ambition, the loneliness masked by productivity, the slow fade into a life where work was everything because you'd let it become everything. He'd seen it because he'd lived it. And he couldn't stand by and watch his granddaughter make the same mistakes without at least trying to intervene. Back in my apartment, William took over my kitchen. He shooed me away when I tried to help, saying I was to sit and relax. So I sat at my dining table, watching him work. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this dish hundreds of times. He chopped garlic and onions, opened cans of tomatoes, tore fresh basil. He worked methodically, precisely, but also with joy. Every now and then, he'd taste something and make a small adjustment. A pinch more salt, a bit more oregano. He talked as he worked, his voice filling my apartment with warmth I hadn't realized was missing. As he cooked, he talked. He told me stories I'd heard before but had forgotten, about how he and Grandma Helen had met at a church dance in 1963, how she'd thought he was too serious, and he'd thought she was too wild, how they'd fallen in love anyway and built a life together, even though it wasn't always easy. He talked about their early years of marriage, how they'd struggled financially at first, how he'd worked long hours as a junior engineer while Helen taught elementary school, how they'd saved every penny to buy their first house. How they'd celebrated with champagne they couldn't really afford when they finally got the keys. He talked about when my dad was born, how Helen had been in labor for 18 hours, how terrified William had been, pacing in the waiting room because fathers weren't allowed in delivery rooms back then. How he'd held Robert for the first time and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. The overwhelming need to provide, to protect, to give this tiny human the best life possible. And that's when he'd made his first mistake, he said. He'd started saying yes to every project, every opportunity, every chance to advance his career. Because more money meant more security. More security meant a better life for his family. That's what he told himself. That's what Helen had believed too at first. He talked about my dad, about what Robert was like as a kid. Stubborn, determined, always wanting to do things himself. He said I reminded him of Dad in that way. That same fierce independence that could be a strength but also a weakness if you weren't careful. If you let it isolate you from the people who loved you. William said he'd missed so much of Robert's childhood. First steps that Helen described to him over the phone from a hotel in another state. First words he heard about secondhand. School plays he couldn't attend because he was working on a bridge project in another city. Birthday parties where his chair sat empty. He'd thought he was doing the right thing. Helen had supported him, had understood the demands of his career. But looking back now, he could see the moments when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. When she'd say it was fine that he'd miss another event. When she'd stopped mentioning things because she knew he'd say no anyway. The smell of cooking tomatoes and garlic filled my apartment, and it suddenly felt less empty. Less like a place I just slept, and more like a home. William set water to boil for the pasta, then came and sat with me while the sauce simmered. He looked around my apartment, really looked at it. The bare walls, the minimalist furniture, the complete lack of personal touches. He said it looked like a hotel room, like somewhere I was just passing through, not like a home where someone actually lived. I felt defensive at first. I told him I liked minimalism, that it helped me focus, that clutter was distracting. William nodded, not arguing, just listening. Then he asked, when was the last time I'd had someone over? When was the last time I'd cooked a meal for a friend? When was the last time I'd done anything in this apartment except sleep and work? I couldn't answer. Because the truth was, I hadn't. I'd turned my home into nothing more than a place to sleep between work sessions. Even my bed was just somewhere I collapsed when exhaustion finally overtook me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually relaxed here, actually enjoyed being here. He asked me to tell him about my work. Not just what I did, but why I did it. What I loved about it. What kept me going. So I told him about the creativity of marketing, about the challenge of finding the right message to connect with people, about the thrill of launching a campaign and seeing it succeed, about how good it felt to solve problems, to help businesses grow. I told him about my first big win at the company, a campaign I'd designed for a sustainable fashion brand that had gone viral, how seeing my work succeed had felt like validation, like proof that I was good at what I did, how that success had led to bigger clients, more responsibility, more opportunities. I told him about the rush of closing a deal. The satisfaction of presenting a strategy and watching clients' faces light up with understanding. The pride of seeing my team execute a campaign flawlessly. The respect I'd earned from my colleagues and competitors. William listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. He said it was clear I was passionate about my work, that I was good at it. That success wasn't a bad thing to want. He could hear the genuine enthusiasm in my voice when I talked about the creative aspects of my job. the way my face had lit up describing that first big campaign success. Then he asked if my work made me happy. Not satisfied or proud, but truly happy. If I woke up excited about my day. If I went to bed feeling fulfilled. If I felt like my life had meaning beyond the metrics and KPIs and quarterly reviews. I opened my mouth to say yes, but the word wouldn't come. I sat there, realizing I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely happy. Accomplished, yes. Validated by promotions and bonuses, sure. But happy? Actually, deeply happy? I couldn't pinpoint it. I thought about my daily routine. Wake up at 6, check emails, shower, dress, grab coffee, get to the office by 8. Work until lunch, eat at my desk while continuing to work until 7 or 8 or sometimes 10 at night. Drive home exhausted, maybe eat something, fall into bed, repeat. Where was the joy in that? Where was the laughter, the connection, the moments that made life feel worth living? I'd been so focused on climbing the ladder that I'd forgotten to look around and see if I even liked the view from where I was standing. William said that was the question I needed to sit with. That all the success in the world didn't matter if it came at the cost of joy, if it meant missing out on the relationships and experiences that made life worth living. He said work was important, but it was only one piece of a full life, and I'd made it the only piece. I felt tears welling up again. I said I didn't know how to fix it, that I'd dug myself into this hole, and I didn't know how to climb out, that my family probably hated me, that I'd missed so much, and I couldn't get any of it back. William reached across the table and took my hand. He said family didn't hate that easily, that they were hurt and disappointed, yes, but hate? No. They loved me. They just didn't know how to reach me anymore. And that wasn't entirely my fault. Relationships worked both ways. But I had to make the first move to rebuild those bridges. He said it wasn't too late, that as long as we were alive, it was never too late to change course. To admit mistakes. To do better. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, and he was still learning it. Every day was a choice. Choose work or choose connection. Choose isolation or choose love. And the beautiful thing about choices was that you could make different ones tomorrow than you made today. The timer beeped. William got up and drained the pasta, mixed it with the sauce, and plated 2 generous portions. He found my wine glasses, poured the wine he'd bought, and set the table properly. He even lit a candle he'd grabbed at the store. Then he sat down across from me and raised his glass. He said, "Here's to Christmas Eve, to second chances, to family, to being brave enough to change." I clinked my glass against his, and we drank. Then we ate, and it was the best meal I'd had in months, maybe years. Not because the food was fancy, though it was delicious, but because I was sharing it with someone I loved. Because I was present, fully there, not thinking about anything except the moment I was in. We talked for hours. William asked about my apartment, my neighborhood, my life in Seattle. I asked about Phoenix, about his health, about the friends he'd made at the retirement community. We laughed about stupid things. We got serious about important things. We just talked, the way family should. Around 1 a.m., William started yawning. I realized I hadn't even asked where he was planning to stay. He said he'd figured he'd sleep on my couch if that was okay. I said, of course it was okay. That he could take my bed and I'd take the couch. He refused, saying he'd slept in worse places and my couch looked comfortable enough. I got him sheets and a pillow and made up the couch for him. He changed in the bathroom, coming out in old-fashioned striped pajamas that made me smile. He looked like something out of a vintage photograph. He settled onto the couch with a contented sigh. Before I headed to my bedroom, William said one more thing. He said tomorrow was Christmas, that my family would all be together in Portland, that it was about a 3-hour drive, that we could make it in time for lunch if we left early, that it wasn't too late. I stood there, my heart pounding. I said I couldn't just show up, that they weren't expecting me, that it would be awkward. William said life was awkward, that real connection was always a little uncomfortable, that if I waited for the perfect moment to fix things, I'd wait forever. Sometimes you just had to jump. I said I'd think about it and went to my bedroom. But I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, thinking about everything William had said, about choices, about second chances, about whether my work was really making me happy or just keeping me busy enough that I didn't have to face my loneliness. I thought about Jennifer's face when I told her I wasn't coming for Thanksgiving, about Mom's tired voice on the phone earlier tonight, about Dad's health issues that I'd been too distracted to really pay attention to, about Daniel's attempts to stay in touch that I'd been too busy to reciprocate, about all the moments I'd missed, all the memories I wasn't part of. And I thought about what William had said, that it wasn't too late, that as long as we were alive, we could choose differently, choose better. Around 3 a.m., I made a decision. I got out of bed, opened my laptop, and sent an email to Patricia. I said I needed to take the rest of the week off, that it was a family emergency, that I'd be back in the office on January 2nd, ready to work, but until then, I was unreachable. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I set my alarm for 7 a.m. and tried to sleep. My mind was racing, but eventually, exhaustion won out. My alarm went off way too early. I stumbled out of bed and found William already awake, folded blankets on the couch, dressed and ready to go. He'd made coffee in my neglected coffee maker. He handed me a mug and said he'd figured I'd decide to go, that he knew his granddaughter better than she knew herself sometimes. I showered quickly, threw some clothes in a bag, and we were on the road by 8 a.m. The drive to Portland on Christmas morning was surreal. The roads were nearly empty. The world was quiet, peaceful, covered in fresh snow. William dozed in the passenger seat and I drove, my mind alternating between excitement and terror. What if they didn't want me there? What if Jennifer turned me away? What if I'd damaged things too badly to fix? But under the fear was something else. Determination. A bone-deep certainty that whatever happened, I needed to try. We hit some traffic outside of Portland, but by 11:30, we were pulling onto Jennifer's street. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. William woke up as I parked in front of her house. He looked at the house, decorated with lights and a wreath on the door, and smiled. He said it looked just like Christmas should. We sat in the car for a moment. William asked if I was ready. I said no, but I was going to do it anyway. He patted my shoulder and said that was the definition of courage. Doing the hard thing even when you were scared. We got out of the car. I grabbed the gifts I'd hastily bought at the 24-hour grocery store last night. They weren't much, just some basics, but it was something. William grabbed his suitcase, and we walked up to the front door together. I could hear noise inside. Kids laughing, adults talking, Christmas music playing. My family all together, probably not expecting me at all. I looked at William. He nodded encouragingly. I raised my hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Daniel stood there, wearing a ridiculous Christmas sweater with a reindeer that had an actual pom-pom for a nose. His eyes widened when he saw me. He said, "Rebecca," and then he looked at William and said, "Grandpa." He stood there frozen for a second, and I was sure he was going to tell us to leave. But then he broke into a huge grin and turned back into the house, yelling, "Jennifer, Mom, Dad, you need to come here right now." I heard footsteps, and then suddenly the doorway was crowded with my family. Jennifer holding her youngest daughter, Sophie, Mom with a dish towel in her hands, Dad looking surprised and confused. There was a moment of silence that felt like it lasted forever. Mom looked at me, then at William, then back at me. I could see her processing, trying to understand what was happening. Jennifer's expression was unreadable, somewhere between shock and something else I couldn't quite identify. Dad just looked tired and a little sad, like he'd been disappointed too many times to let himself hope. I realized I needed to say something. That I couldn't just stand there and expect everything to be okay without putting in the work. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking. I felt like I might throw up or cry or both. I said I was sorry. That I'd been an idiot. That I'd let work consume me, and I'd hurt everyone I loved in the process. That I'd missed Thanksgiving, and I'd planned to miss Christmas too, but Grandpa showed up at my door last night and made me realize what I was throwing away. That I knew I couldn't fix everything with one visit, but I wanted to try. That I wanted to be part of this family again, if they'd let me. My voice cracked on the last words. I felt tears starting to fall, and I didn't try to stop them. I was done pretending I was fine. Done acting like my choices hadn't hurt people. Done hiding behind the excuse of work. There was another beat of silence, and I could see my family members looking at each other, having some kind of wordless conversation. Max, Jennifer's middle child, peeked around his mom's legs, looking at me with curiosity. He whispered something I couldn't hear, and Jennifer shushed him gently. Then Mom dropped her dish towel and rushed forward. She wrapped me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. Catherine said you came. You're here. You actually came. Her voice was thick with tears, and I felt her whole body shaking. She pulled back, tears running down her face, and cupped my cheek with one hand. She said that's all she wanted, for me to be there, that nothing else mattered. I started crying harder then, big ugly sobs that I couldn't control. I said I was so sorry, that I should have been here all along, that I'd wasted so much time. Mom just shook her head and pulled me close again, saying I was here now. That's what mattered. Dad came next, hugging both Mom and me. Robert said he'd been worried about me, that he'd seen the signs for a while now, the way I was pushing everyone away, that he'd tried to give me space, thinking I needed to figure things out on my own. But he'd been scared. Scared I'd work myself to death before I realized what was important. Scared he'd lose me to the same obsession that had almost cost him his own family years ago. His voice broke on those last words, and I realized he was crying too. My dad, who I'd rarely seen cry, who'd always been the strong one, was crying because of me, because he'd been worried about me, because he loved me and didn't know how to reach me. Dad hugged William too, welcoming his father with obvious relief and joy. He said thank you for bringing her back to us. William just patted his son's back and said, "That's what family does." Daniel pulled me into a bear hug next, lifting me off my feet a little. He said he'd missed his big sister, that it sucked not having me around to give him advice or tell him when he was being stupid, that Emma had heard so many stories about me that she'd been starting to think I was a myth. He was joking, but I could hear the real hurt underneath. His girlfriend Emma, who I'd only met twice before, hugged me too. She was warm and kind, saying it was good to see me again. That Daniel had been worried about me, even though he tried not to show it. That she was glad I was here. Then Jennifer. She was the last to move, still standing in the doorway holding little Sophie. Our eyes met, and I could see everything in her expression. All the hurt I'd caused, the missed birthdays and broken promises, the phone calls I'd cut short, the times I'd chosen work over being there for her, the gradual erosion of the close relationship we'd once had. We looked at each other, and I could see she was struggling. Part of her wanted to protect herself, to not let me hurt her again. Part of her wanted to believe this was real, that I was really trying to change. I watched the internal battle play out on her face. I said I was so sorry, that she didn't have to forgive me right away, that I understood if she was angry, that I'd been a terrible sister and I wanted to do better, that I'd hurt her the most and I knew it. That I didn't deserve another chance, but I was asking for one anyway. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. She handed Sophie to Michael, who I hadn't even noticed standing behind her with Lily and Max. Then she stepped forward, and for a moment I thought she might turn away, but instead she hugged me. She said she'd been so angry. That she'd cried after our phone call when I'd told her I wasn't coming. That she'd been ready to write me off, to protect herself from more disappointment. That she'd told Michael she was done trying. That if I didn't want to be part of the family, she couldn't force me. But seeing me standing there, actually showing up, actually trying, she couldn't stay angry. She said we had a lot to talk about, a lot to work through. That one visit didn't fix everything, but it was a start, and she was willing to meet me halfway if I was serious about being present. I promised her I was, that I'd turned off my work email, that I was taking the rest of the year off, that I was going to figure out how to balance my life better because I couldn't keep living the way I'd been living, that I knew saying it wasn't enough, that I had to actually do it, and I was committed to trying. Jennifer pulled back and looked at me, really looked at me. She said I looked tired, that I looked thinner than the last time she'd seen me. That she could see the toll my lifestyle had taken. I admitted I hadn't been taking care of myself. That work had become everything, and I'd forgotten how to do anything else. She said then it was a good thing I was here. That Mom was going to feed me until I couldn't move, that the kids were going to run me ragged playing with them, that we were all going to talk and laugh and remember what it felt like to be a family, and that I'd better be ready, because the kids had been talking about Great-Grandpa William for the past hour, ever since Daniel had texted saying we were on our way. We all moved inside, the cold air finally motivating us to stop standing in the doorway. The house was warm and bright, exactly how Christmas should feel. The tree was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in ornaments and lights. Some of the ornaments were clearly homemade by the kids, lopsided and glittery and perfect. There were stockings hung by the fireplace, including one with my name on it that made my throat tight. Presents spilled out from under the tree, wrapped in colorful paper. The smell of turkey cooking filled the air, along with something sweet, maybe cookies or pie. Jennifer's kids, Lily, Max, and Sophie, swarmed around William and me. Lily, the oldest at 7, took charge, pulling William toward the living room. She said they'd been waiting for him, that she had so many questions about Arizona. Did he see any cowboys? What about cacti? Were there really roadrunners like in the cartoons? Max, who was 5, was more interested in William's suitcase. He asked if William had brought presents. Michael gently reminded him that wasn't polite to ask, but William just laughed. He said he'd brought the best present of all. He'd brought their Aunt Rebecca back to them. Lily stopped then and looked at me seriously. She asked if I was staying this time, if I was going to leave again right after Christmas like I did last time. The question hit me hard because I had done exactly that. I'd come for Christmas 2 years ago, stayed for barely 24 hours, and then rushed back to Seattle for a meeting that probably could have waited. I knelt down so I was at her level. I said I was staying for the whole week, that I wanted to spend time with her and her brothers and everyone else, that I was done running away. Lily considered this, then declared that was good because they were playing a new board game later and needed another player. We settled into the chaos of a family Christmas. Mom put me to work in the kitchen, which felt right. We peeled potatoes together, and she caught me up on everything I'd missed. Neighborhood gossip, updates on relatives, stories about the kids, normal, everyday things that I realized I'd been starving for. Dad and William sat in the living room, talking about politics and sports and life. I could hear them laughing, and it made my chest feel full. Daniel and Emma were playing with the kids, building some elaborate Lego creation. Michael and Jennifer were finishing up the turkey, working together with the easy coordination of a couple who'd been together for years. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't thinking about work, wasn't checking my phone, wasn't mentally planning my next move. I was just there, present in the moment, part of my family again. Lunch was a feast. Turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls, all of it homemade and delicious. We crowded around Jennifer's dining table, adding chairs and place settings to fit everyone. Max said grace, stumbling over the words a little, but managing to thank God for family and presents and snow. As we ate, we talked and laughed and shared stories. Daniel told an embarrassing story about me from high school that had everyone cracking up, I retaliated with a story about him. Mom reminded us both that she had way more embarrassing stories about all of us, which shut down that conversation quickly. Dad asked William about his flight, and William recounted his impulsive decision to fly to Seattle, making it sound like a grand adventure. Jennifer leaned over at one point and quietly thanked me for coming. She said it meant more than I knew, especially to Mom and Dad. That they'd been really worried about me. I squeezed her hand and said thank you for letting me back in, for not shutting the door in my face when I deserved it. After lunch, we opened presents. The kids tore through their gifts with the beautiful lack of restraint that only children have. The adults took turns, savoring the moment. I was embarrassed by my last-minute grocery store gifts, but everyone was gracious about it. Mom loved the candles I'd gotten her. Dad appreciated the coffee I'd picked out. Jennifer laughed at the wine, saying she definitely needed it with 3 kids. Then William pulled out his suitcase and started distributing presents he'd brought from Phoenix. He'd actually planned this, I realized. He hadn't just impulsively shown up at my door. He'd been planning to come to Portland all along. He'd probably booked his ticket to Seattle to make a stop and check on me first. For me, he'd brought a photo album. Old pictures of our family, going back decades. There were photos of me as a baby, as a kid, as a teenager. Pictures of Jennifer and Daniel and me together. Pictures of family vacations and holiday gatherings. Pictures of Grandma Helen, her smile bright and warm. I flipped through the album, and with each page, I felt the weight of what I'd been missing. All these moments, all these memories, all these people who loved me. I'd been so focused on building a career, on achieving success, that I'd forgotten why any of it mattered. You didn't work for the sake of working. You worked to build a life, to support the people you loved, to create meaning and connection. William sat down next to me as I looked at the photos. He pointed to one of Grandma Helen at a Christmas dinner. She was laughing at something, her head thrown back, pure joy on her face. He said that was the woman he remembered. Not the sick woman at the end, but the vibrant, loving person who'd made every gathering feel special. He said he kept these photos to remind himself of what mattered. That when he was feeling lonely in Phoenix, he'd look through them and remember he was part of something bigger. Part of a family, a legacy, a story that stretched back and would continue forward. And he wanted me to have them, to remember the same thing. I hugged him, careful because he felt so fragile. I thanked him for coming to get me, for not giving up on me, for showing me what I was about to lose. He said that's what family did. We showed up for each other, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a beautiful blur. We watched Christmas movies. We played board games, and Lily absolutely destroyed us all at Monopoly. We had leftovers for dinner because no one could eat another big meal. We laughed until our sides hurt. We just existed together, and it was perfect. That night, after the kids were in bed and the adults were sitting around with final glasses of wine, Jennifer asked me what I was going to do. About work, about my life in Seattle, about everything. I said I didn't know exactly, that I needed to figure out how to set better boundaries, how to make space for both career and family, how to not let one consume the other. Dad said he was proud of me for recognizing the problem, that a lot of people went their whole lives without figuring out what really mattered. Robert said he'd made similar mistakes when we were kids, working too much, missing too many moments. He didn't want to see me make the same mistakes he did. Mom said I always had a place in this family, that no matter how much time passed or how many holidays I missed, I was always welcome, always loved. But she also said I needed to do the work, that relationships required effort and presence. That you couldn't just show up once a year and expect everything to be fine. I knew she was right. I said I'd do better, that I'd call more, visit more, actually show up. That I'd learn to say no at work sometimes, that I'd prioritize differently. Daniel raised his glass and said he'd hold me to that. We all clinked glasses and it felt like a new beginning. I stayed in Portland for the entire week, just like I'd promised Lily. I helped Jennifer with the kids. I went to lunch with just Mom, giving us time to really talk. I went to a Blazers game with Dad and Daniel. I spent afternoons with William, listening to more stories, soaking up time with him. Each day I felt a little more grounded, a little more like myself. The version of myself that existed before I'd gotten so lost in work and ambition. I still cared about my career. I still wanted to do well. But it wasn't the only thing that defined me anymore. On New Year's Eve, we all gathered at Jennifer's again. We played games with the kids until they passed out around 10 p.m. Then the adults stayed up, talking and laughing, counting down to midnight. When the clock struck 12, we hugged and wished each other a happy new year. Jennifer said, "Here's to new beginnings, to family, to being present." We all echoed her toast. William pulled me aside as everyone was celebrating. He said he was proud of me, that taking this first step was the hardest part, that from here, it would get easier. He'd be heading back to Phoenix in a few days, but he wanted me to promise I'd keep showing up, for my family, but also for myself. I promised, and I meant it. When I drove back to Seattle on January 2nd, I felt different, lighter somehow. I'd survived a whole week without checking work email. The world hadn't ended. VisionTech's product launch had happened without me being there for every single second. My career wasn't ruined. Back at my apartment, I looked around and saw it differently. It wasn't enough anymore. This sterile, minimalist space that reflected nothing about who I was or what I loved. I decided right then that I was going to make changes. Real changes. I started small. I put up some of the photos from William's album. I bought a plant. I actually decorated, making my apartment feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between work sessions. I reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with and started rebuilding those connections. At work, I had a conversation with Patricia. I explained that I needed better work-life balance. That I couldn't keep working 70-hour weeks. That I was still committed to doing excellent work, but I also needed to have a life outside the office. To my surprise, she was supportive. She said she'd been worried about me burning out, that the company valued me and wanted me to stick around, which meant keeping me healthy and happy. We worked out a new arrangement. I'd still take on major clients, but I'd have support. I'd delegate more. I'd set boundaries around working hours and weekends. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. So much better. I started making it to Portland once a month, sometimes just for the weekend, sometimes for longer. I video called Mom every week. I texted Jennifer regularly, not just logistics, but actual conversation. I made it to Max's birthday party. I didn't miss Easter. I was there for Daniel's graduation from his physical therapy program. William and I talked on the phone every Sunday. He'd tell me about his week, about the friends he'd made in Phoenix, about the activities at the retirement community. I'd tell him about my work, my life, the small victories of building a more balanced existence. He was my accountability partner, gently calling me out when I started slipping into old patterns. It wasn't always easy. There were times when work stress made me want to cancel plans. Times when it felt easier to just focus on my career and not deal with the messiness of relationships. But then I'd remember Christmas. I'd remember sitting alone in my apartment with a frozen dinner, feeling utterly hollow. I'd remember William showing up at my door with a suitcase and a second chance, and I'd make the harder choice, the better choice. 6 months after that Christmas, Jennifer called me and asked if I wanted to go on a sister trip. Just the two of us, no kids, no husbands, no parents. A weekend in San Francisco. I almost said I had too much work. Then I caught myself, checked my calendar, moved some things around, and said yes. That weekend with Jennifer healed something in both of us. We talked about everything, the resentments, the hurt feelings, the way we'd let distance grow between us. We cried, we laughed. We remembered who we'd been before life got complicated. And we committed to not letting that much time and space build up again. On our last night in San Francisco, sitting at a restaurant overlooking the bay, Jennifer said she was glad I'd shown up that Christmas, that she'd been ready to give up on me, to protect herself from more disappointment. But seeing me choose family, choose connection, it had given her hope. She said I'd changed, and she could see it. I was more present, more engaged, more like the sister she remembered. I told her it was because of William, because he'd refused to let me isolate myself completely, because he'd shown me what I was losing before it was too late. Jennifer raised her glass and said, "Here's to Grandpa, to him showing up when we need him most." We drank to that. A year after that transformative Christmas, we all gathered at Jennifer's house again for the holiday. This time, I was there from the beginning. I'd taken the whole week off, and I'd driven down on December 23rd. I helped with the cooking prep. I played with the kids. I wrapped presents with Mom. I watched football with Dad and Daniel. I was fully, completely present. William flew in from Phoenix again, but this time it was planned. He had his own stocking on the fireplace. The kids had made him welcome home signs. He was part of our holiday tradition now, not just a surprise visitor, but an expected and beloved presence. On Christmas Eve, after the kids were in bed, the adults sat around Jennifer's living room. The fire was crackling. Snow was falling outside. Christmas lights twinkled on the tree. It was the picture-perfect holiday scene. But more than that, it was real. These were my people, my family, the ones who'd loved me even when I'd been too lost to love myself properly. William looked around at all of us and said this was what he'd hoped for. That when he'd shown up at my door a year ago, he'd been scared he was too late. That I'd drifted too far. But look at us now, all together, all connected, all making the effort to show up for each other. Dad thanked William for going to get me, for not giving up. Catherine said she'd been so worried that she'd lost me to my career, that she'd have her daughter's physical presence sometimes but never her real attention or engagement. But now she had me back, really back. Jennifer said this year had been good, that having me around more, being able to actually count on me, it had changed things for all of us. It had reminded everyone that family was worth fighting for, worth prioritizing, worth the effort. I felt tears welling up, but they were good tears, grateful tears. I said I was sorry for the years I'd missed, for the ways I'd hurt everyone by being absent even when I was physically there. But I was also grateful. Grateful that they'd been patient with me. Grateful that William had intervened. Grateful for second chances. William said that was the thing about family. We got second chances, third chances, as many chances as it took because love didn't give up easily. And the beautiful thing about choices was that we made them every single day. Every day we chose to show up or withdraw, to prioritize connection or isolation, to live fully or just exist. He said he'd learned that lesson too late with Grandma Helen, but he'd learned it. And he'd been determined to pass it on, to make sure his grandchildren didn't make the same mistakes he did. To show us that success without connection was just emptiness dressed up in fancy clothes. Daniel said William had changed his perspective too. That seeing what I'd been going through and how William had intervened, it had made him think about his own life, about making sure he didn't let his career consume him the way mine had consumed me. About being intentional with his time and his relationships. We talked late into the night, sharing and laughing and just being together, and I realized this was what I'd been missing. This sense of belonging. This feeling of being part of something bigger than myself. This knowledge that I mattered to people, not for what I accomplished or achieved, but just for being me. The next morning, Christmas Day, I woke up in Jennifer's guest room feeling content. I could hear the kids already up and buzzing with excitement. I could smell coffee brewing. I could hear Mom's laugh from downstairs. I didn't reach for my phone to check emails. I didn't think about work at all. I just got up, got dressed, and headed downstairs to be with my family. We had a wonderful Christmas. It was chaotic and loud and perfect. The kids loved their presents. We ate too much food. We played games and watched movies and told stories. It was everything a holiday should be. That evening, as things were winding down, I found myself sitting with William on the couch. The kids were playing with their new toys. The other adults were in the kitchen doing dishes and packing up leftovers. It was a quiet moment in the midst of the beautiful chaos. William said he wanted to tell me something, that he was getting older, and he didn't know how many more Christmases he'd have. He wanted me to know that coming to Seattle last year, showing up at my door, it was one of the best decisions he'd ever made. Not just because it had helped me, but because it had brought all of us closer. It had reminded everyone what mattered. I felt a lump in my throat. I told him he couldn't talk like that he had plenty of Christmases left. He smiled and said he hoped so, but either way, he was grateful. Grateful for this family. Grateful for this time together. Grateful that I'd been brave enough to change course. He said change was hard. That it was always easier to keep doing what you'd been doing, even when it was making you miserable. But real growth, real transformation, it required courage. It required being willing to admit you were wrong, to ask for help, to show up even when you were scared of rejection. I'd done all of that. I'd been vulnerable and honest. I'd prioritized differently. I'd rebuilt bridges I'd burned. And look at the result. I had my family back. I had balance in my life. I had joy. I hugged him, careful and close. I said thank you for everything, for showing up when I needed someone, for believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself, for giving me a second chance. He patted my back gently. He said that's what grandpas were for, to show up, to believe, to give second chances. And to make sure their grandchildren knew they were loved, no matter what. Now, sitting here 2 years after that first life-changing Christmas, I can honestly say I'm happy. Really, genuinely happy. My career is still important to me. I still work hard and take pride in what I do, but it's not everything anymore. It's one part of a full life. I make it to Portland at least once a month. I never miss major holidays or birthdays. I video call Mom every week without fail. Jennifer and I have sister weekends regularly. Daniel and I actually have a relationship now. I know Emma well, and I'm excited about their upcoming wedding. William is still in Phoenix, still healthy and active at 79. We talk every Sunday, and he's still my touchstone, the person who reminds me what really matters. He's proud of the changes I've made, and he tells me so regularly. My apartment in Seattle is actually a home now. It's decorated with photos and memories. I have plants that I manage to keep alive most of the time. I host friends for dinner. I'm part of my neighborhood community. I have a life outside of work. At the office, I'm still successful. I still have great clients and win awards, but I also leave at reasonable hours. I don't work weekends unless it's absolutely necessary. I take vacations. I'm present in meetings but not consumed by work outside of them. And you know what? I'm better at my job because of it. Being more balanced has made me more creative, more strategic, more effective, but the biggest change is internal. I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding in work to avoid dealing with life. I'm present. I'm engaged. I'm connected to the people I love. I know what matters, and I prioritize it accordingly. Sometimes I think about that Christmas Eve 2 years ago. Me alone in my apartment with a frozen dinner, feeling hollow and lost. I think about hearing that knock on the door and finding William standing there with his suitcase. I think about how different my life would be if he hadn't shown up, if he'd just called instead or sent a card, or let me continue on my self-destructive path. I think about the courage it took for him to fly across the country at his age, to intervene when he could have just minded his own business, to refuse to let me isolate myself completely. He saved me that night, not in a dramatic movie-style way, but in the quiet, persistent way that real love saves people, by showing up, by being present, by refusing to give up. And I think about my own courage since then, the courage to show up at Jennifer's door on Christmas Day, not knowing if I'd be welcomed, the courage to change my work habits and risk career consequences, the courage to be vulnerable with my family, to admit my mistakes, to ask for second chances, the courage to live differently, to prioritize differently, to be different. It hasn't been a fairy tale transformation. There have been setbacks and struggles, times when I've slipped into old patterns and had to consciously course correct. Times when work stress has made me want to retreat into that safe, numbing focus on career. Times when family dynamics have been difficult and I've wanted to run away, but I keep choosing to stay, to show up, to do the work, because I know what the alternative looks like. I lived it for years, and I never want to go back to that hollow, disconnected existence where success was just a way to avoid dealing with life. Last week, Mom called me with some news. Dad's health issues have gotten more serious. He needs surgery, nothing immediately life-threatening, but significant. 2 years ago, I would have sent flowers and called to check in but wouldn't have rearranged my schedule. I would have told myself I couldn't take time off work. This time, I didn't hesitate. I told Patricia I needed to take a week off to be with my family. She didn't question it. She knows now that my family comes first, and she respects that. I drove to Portland the next day and have been staying with my parents, helping Mom, being there for Dad. Yesterday, Dad and I were sitting in his doctor's waiting room, and he took my hand. Robert said he was grateful I was there, that it meant everything to Mom and to him, that he knew I was busy with work and he appreciated me making the time. I squeezed his hand and said there was nowhere else I'd rather be. And I meant it. 2 years ago, that wouldn't have been true. But now I know that being there for the people you love, especially in the hard moments, that's what life is really about. Not the clients or the campaigns or the corner office, just showing up, being present, loving people while you have the chance. Dad smiled and said I'd changed a lot. He said he'd been worried about me for years, watching me disappear into my work. But he was proud of the person I'd become, of the choices I was making, of the life I was building. We sat there in that bland medical waiting room holding hands, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Grateful that I'd gotten a second chance. Grateful that William had shown up at my door with a suitcase and refused to let me spend Christmas alone. Grateful that my family had been willing to welcome me back despite my years of absence. Grateful for every moment since then that I'd chosen connection over isolation. The nurse called Dad's name and we stood up. As we walked toward the exam room, I thought about that Christmas Eve. About frozen dinners and empty apartments. About loneliness and regret. About a knock on the door that changed everything. And I thought about now. About being here with my dad, supporting my mom, being part of my family's life. About knowing what matters and living accordingly. About having learned the lesson before it was too late. I don't know what the future holds. Dad's surgery, William's health, my career, all of it is uncertain. But I know that whatever comes, I won't face it alone. I have my family. I'm present in my life. I'm connected to the people I love. And that, more than any professional achievement, any promotion, any success, that is what makes life worth living. So here I am, 2 years later, a completely different person than I was that Christmas Eve. Still me, still ambitious, still passionate about my work, but also balanced, connected, present. Part of something bigger than myself. Part of a family that loves me and that I love back, actively and intentionally. And it all started with a knock on the door. With a grandfather who refused to let his granddaughter spend Christmas alone. With a suitcase and a plane ticket and the courage to show up. Thank you, Grandpa William, for showing up when I needed you most, for teaching me what really matters, for giving me a second chance to get it right. This Christmas, I won't be alone in my apartment with a frozen dinner. I'll be in Portland with my family. All of us together, present and connected and grateful, just the way Christmas should be, just the way life should be.